camped for a fateful 2 days on Baling near the Thai frontier for talks between government representatives and communist terrorist leaders. As the chief actors in the drama arrived, hopes ran high, not only among the Baling townsfolk, but among all the people of Malaya, that by some miracle the communists would repent of the evil they had done and surrender for the good of the country. The whole town flocks to the school, which has been prepared as the conference room to watch the chief ministers arrive. Tunku Abdul Rahman and Mr. David Marshall are as one in their attitude to communism, supported by Sir Cheng Lok Tan. They are prepared to give the communists a fair hearing in the hopes of a peaceful settlement. The austere conference room waits with a sense of history, while a teacher's house has been prepared to accommodate the communists. Ceremony in the arrival of the communist delegates. 2 ordinary police trucks with hard benches picked them up at the jungle edge and brought them into Baling. All necks craned for a glimpse of the number 1 terrorist. There he is, that's him. Peng, directly responsible for a brutal 7-year campaign of murder and terrorism against the ordinary people of Malaya. Propaganda chief Chen Chan is with him, and also Abdul Rashid bin Maidin, who escaped from the Malacca detention camp in 1951. Nearly 100 pressmen and photographers wait expectantly as the talks are about to begin. The government delegation is confident, as well they might be, led by elected chief ministers with every right to speak with authority on behalf of the Malayan people. Escorted by Mr. John Davis, the famous Force 136 guerrilla leader and former colleague of Peng during the Japanese occupation. However starved his rank and file may be, it's obvious that the boss has been living well in his Siamese hideout. The communists' first demand, as expected, was for recognition of the Malayan Communist Party. This was flatly refused. They then demanded complete freedom for all terrorists should they surrender, and the right to form a new political party. These demands were also turned down. The Tunku then yielded a point that surrendered terrorists could join existing political parties once they had proved their loyalty to Malaya. But further he could not go without imperiling the country's security. The crowd and pressmen waited tense while the talks went into night session. But the communists refused to accept the amnesty terms. The amnesty means surrender, they said. We will not accept surrender at any time. We will carry on the struggle to the last man. Thus proving beyond dispute that in their lust for power, they have no care or feeling for the ordinary people who long for the end of terrorism. There was no more that the Tunku could do without endangering the people he represents and the very country itself. So the communists returned to the jungle to continue their war, or to think again, certain of one thing, that they are now dealing with the people's representatives. Meanwhile, the chief ministers give the press a full account of what happened, freely answering all their questions. The Tunku declined to call the unsatisfactory outcome a breakdown. He is confident that the communists are so anxious to end the war that they will be ready for further talks when he returns from London. I will never give in, he told them, and the people of Malaya are with him.
Do you now regret starting the war?
I never regret, because it was not we, CPM, who started the war. It was the British government who fired the first shot And we return, or we retaliate with the second shot. So the British government and its colonial policy should be responsible for all this.
It's turning language upside down. He provoked the emergency by starting off by murdering a few rubber planters and other people in eastern Malaya.
It was they who were out to take over the country.
We want to make some improvement. They want to drag back to what was in 1941, before the Japanese invasion.
He's talking absolute rubbish, quite frankly.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the land of bananas and coconuts, also known as the brutal capitalist dictatorship of Kuala Lumpur. I hope you're having an amazing day, because if you're having an amazing day, I'm having an amazing day. If I'm having an amazing day, well, you should also be having an amazing day. And if I can have an amazing day in this brutal, oppressive Malaysian heat, so can you. Look at how dystopian this place looks. Look at all this dystopian architecture. Look at it. So awful, right? So depressing. Ever wonder why capitalist architecture is just so fucking bland and ugly? Beats me, right? But anyway, we live with what we've got, you know. So let's get cracking with today's video. Now, history buffs of the region will be aware that the Malayan Emergency was a 40-year-long guerrilla war fought between the Communist Party of Malaya and the colonial British authorities, followed by the post-colonial authorities of Malaya, whom the Communist Party saw as illegitimate rulers of the land, since most of them, like the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Tunku Abdul Rahman, as well as the Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, were basically post-colonial authorities who were installed by the Brits, right? And so this jungle war lasted for 40 years, or more specifically, there were two emergencies. One from 1948 until 1960, and one from 1968 until 1988, followed by the Hat Yai Peace Accords, which was basically a peace agreement signed between Peng, the leader of the Malayan Communist Party, and the Malaysian government, basically. So, by all accounts, the emergency was a fiasco, and the objectives of the Communist Party in order to establish a socialist state in Malaya, followed by Malaysia, when Sabah and Sarawak end up becoming part of the federation, did not succeed. But the question is, why did it not succeed? What are some lessons we can learn from this that we socialists can avoid repeating in the future? So, without further ado, let's begin. Now, when it concerns the causes of the emergency, I think it best for me to defer to the professional historians and let them explain it to you guys. So feel free to ask a professional historian on the history of Malaya, right? But basically, in a nutshell, let me explain it to you guys in 5 minutes. Basically, World War II basically shattered any notion of British hegemony, right? When the Prince of Wales and the Repulse ship were basically sunk in a matter of hours by people who were regarded as little rice-eating midgets, aka the Japanese army, right? And the Japanese basically began a most cruel crusade on the island of Malaya and Singapore, basically, mainly targeting the Chinese population, right? And they came under, like any national socialist, the Japanese used this notion of the greater co-Asian prosperity sphere, right? And they used slogans such as Asia for Asians and kick the British colonizers out, right? And these slogans were basically used in order to win the support of the local masses, namely the local majority, the Malays, many of whom were put in positions of colonial authority over the Chinese as well as the Indians, right? And the Japanese, well, they were most cruel to the Chinese, whom they regarded as being natural enemies of Japan, because Japan, until the Meiji Revolution, was basically seen by China as the unsuccessful redneck nation that tried to imitate the Chinese in any way possible, right? So, until the Meiji Restoration in the 1860s, Japan was basically viewed rather as basically China's unsuccessful redneck country bumpkin cousin, right? And so the Japanese, when they attained a position of power, right, they would exact extreme revenge against the Chinese for years and years of resentment, right? So many Chinese in Malaya, because they were treated so cruelly by the Japanese, right, and they were treated as the lowest of the lowest filth on the colonial caste system under the Japanese, went into the jungles to lead a protracted jungle war against the Japanese, right? And although these Chinese did not necessarily consider themselves to be communists, the ideology of communism basically was attractive to them, because basically Mao Zedong, the man who was fighting the Japanese in China, was basically a communist, right? So although many of these guerrilla fighters, the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army, basically did not really consider themselves communists, they basically led a protracted jungle war against the Japanese, right? And although many of these Chinese were literally fighting for their own survival in a war of self-defense against the Japanese, did not consider themselves communists, well, they united under the banner of communism, because communism tends to attract the downtrodden people of the world, known as the revolutionary subject, right? So under the Marxian doctrine, the revolutionary subject is basically the most to gain and the least to lose, or the people with the most to gain and the least to lose. And under the Japanese occupation, the Chinese working class were really the revolutionary subject, right? But basically, what happens is after the Japanese leave Malaya, right, and the British come back, well, the people of Malaya basically have lost their faith in the British colonial administration, because the British basically lorded it over us as our bosses, and we were trained to think that these white men basically were gods, basically. So gods that were infallible, that could not be defeated by any force of nature whatsoever. And to see them being paraded down the streets, half naked by, well, rice-eating Asian men half their size, if one good thing came out of the occupation, it was this. It instilled in the people a sense of revolutionary, anti-imperialist consciousness, and it instilled in them the belief, or the knowledge rather, that, the British could not be trusted to protect them, right? And we have to be the masters of our own destiny, right? And so when the British came back, then, according to the Communist Party leader of Malaya, Peng, basically, in order to save face, what they did was they ended up opening their whites-only clubs to the locals, being more congenial to a group of selected elite locals, basically opening up mid-level government positions to certain members of the elites in the region, and being nicer or more congenial to the yellow or brown person. But the British would remain the masters and the bullies, right? So basically, that is basically how the colonial surrogate is created. Basically, the labor aristocracy that results because the British seem to favor a select elite group of the local people in the region, namely the sons of feudal lords or the children of the capitalist class, right? People like Tunku Abdul Rahman and Lee Kuan Yew. But that's really another topic for another day, right? So, the communists, from being rewarded OBEs, or Orders of the British Empire, for the valiant struggle in fighting the Empire of Japan in a marriage of convenience with the British, end up becoming treated as terrorists once again, right? So, the British, during the war, actually released people from the Communist Party who had been locked up for sedition, right? They released them from their prison, and they basically intended after the war to throw those people back into prison and to deport the Chinese who fought for the communists, basically. So basically, once again, the British and the communists became enemies again, you know, after there was no more common enemy to fight, the Japanese, right? But the emergency, really, according to most historical accounts, begins in Sungai Siput, a state in Perak. A rubber plantation in Perak, a northern town in Malaya, right? And in 1948, 3 young communist gunmen stormed the plantation because some workers have been complaining about mistreatment by their brutal British bosses, right? So these young idealistic communist gunmen shoot these 3 British guys dead, right? And basically this gets the colonial authorities in a frenzy because basically the British community is basically calling for retribution, for punitive retribution, right? And, you know, this is when the emergency officially begins, right? But there were other factors that Western historians tend to gloss over, at least. For example, the so-called banana currency. The returning British colonials, when they first came back, what they did was to immediately demonetize the Japanese banana notes, leading to people being thrust into grinding poverty overnight. So overnight, when people were already barely scraping by to get by, the British have to come around, and in order to symbolically show that they do not recognize the legitimacy of Japanese rule, they demonetize the banana note, and guess what? 3 to 4 years of savings immediately gone in a jiffy like that, right? And many people were starving, couldn't even afford a bowl of rice, right? And so, naturally, what do you expect when, you know, with the exception of those people who had stashes of straight dollars saved away before the Japanese occupation, the people who had earned years of Japanese banana notes, what happens is they found themselves, you know, penniless, literally penniless. And when that happens, what do you expect but riots on the street when they couldn't even afford a bowl of rice? And when frustrated Malayans of all races banded together to protest peacefully against the British, well, what happened is that the British used really, really violent suppressive techniques in order to stamp down on their protests, on their peaceful protests, right? And even worse, in December of 1948, there occurs what is historically known as the Batang Kali massacre, which the British still have not apologized for, in which, you know, over 20 villages in a place called Batang Kali, most of them young Malayan Chinese men, who weren't communists, by the way, are rounded up by the Scots Guards. They are marched out of their houses. They are told to kneel, and they are shot. They are killed in cold blood, basically. By all accounts, this would be a war crime, right? But Britain's propaganda department they really took great pains in order to cover up this massacre, right? And when the victims or the descendants of the victims of Batang Kali went to the UK to try and seek retribution or to try and seek justice, Queen Elizabeth, well, dear old late Queen Lizzie, just ignored them, right? So, as you can see, the beginning of the communist emergency, was a multifaceted and very, very complex chain of events, right? It wasn't simply a matter of the communists being unreasonable terrorists, right? It was a very complicated chain of events. But today, we're going to go through 5 takeaways that we can use on why socialism, right, did not succeed at taking off in Malaya in the early 20th century, basically. All right, so let's get into it. Okay, reason number 1, lack of clear direction due to a lack of theory, right? Now, in most communist parties around the world, or at least in most official communist parties like the Bolshevik Party of Russia or the Chinese Communist Party, you need to have a sound and holistic knowledge in Marxist theory. They don't just accept any Jing Zheng Zhou off the street. What you have to do if you want to be a party member is you actually need to be quite well versed in communist theory, right? You need to have quite a holistic grasp of Marx and Lenin and other communist writers, right? But the vast majority of the people in the Communist Party, at least in the 1930s and 1940s, were basically influenced by the developments going on in China, right? They identified as communists not because of some fuzzy old man who looked vaguely like Santa Claus and was the Jew that Hitler hated the most, right? They were communists mainly because, well, they were the revolutionary subject. They understood that much, right? They understood that it was they who were the class of people who had the most to gain and the least to lose out of a communist revolution, right? That much they understood, right? So at that time, it was the Chinese working class who were the most underprotected and vulnerable group of people in the Communist Party, right? Who formed the bulk of the Communist Party, because, as I've said, the only party that was basically protecting the Chinese from the Japanese was basically the Communist Party, right? So, as a result, although it tried really hard to shake off the image of the Chinese party that the British tried to stick on it, the vast majority were Chinese because they were the most oppressed group, the working class Chinese, not even talking about the Chinese capitalists, yeah? Some of whom even ended up as Japanese collaborators. The working class Chinese were the most vulnerable, oppressed group, so naturally communism as an ideology appealed to them the most, right? Followed by the oppressed Indian laborers in the rubber plantations. But these people who were working in brutal conditions for many, many hours a day didn't really have time to basically study theory in depth, right? So the problem is that when they actually tried to launch their revolution, it was basically a rather disorganized revolution with no clear goal at the end of it, right? The goal, of course, was to establish a socialist state in Malaya, right? Where the means of production would be controlled by the natives of Malaya, which, in their view, included the Malays, the Chinese, the Indians, as well as the Aboriginal people as well, right? The 3 stars on the Communist Party of Malaya cap actually represent the 3 major races of Malaya, the Chinese, the Malays, and the Indians. But the fact is that these people were largely a group of extremely, how shall I say, I don't want to call them uneducated, but they didn't have much in the way of theory. So, you know, when it came to explaining their concepts to the masses, well, basically, these people basically could only talk about class struggle or armed resistance against the colonial forces. But they didn't have a clear vision of what to do with the means of production or the forces of production once they'd actually taken over and established their communist state. And this is very, very clearly illustrated in the Baling Talks when Peng, the communist leader, meets with Tunku Abdul Rahman, right? The Prime Minister of Malaya. Well, back then he was the Chief Minister, but he became the Prime Minister. He couldn't really explain in depth to Tunku or David Marshall or Tan Cheng Lock how exactly he was going to utilize the forces of production, right? One of his terms was that, well, he wanted to lead the opposition in post-colonial Malaya, a term which the Tunku flatly refused, because the Tunku said, you know, Chiang Kai-shek has an island to run to, but if you guys take over, I don't have an island. But the problem is that Peng and the communists didn't really have a clear goal in their mind on what to do with the forces of production. Their main aim was basically to take over the country and then settle theory later. But, you know, I think every good revolution has got to have a good balance of theory as well as praxis, right? If it's all theory, you end up becoming like those armchair socialists, you know, those debate bros in America who are at NATO, basically, no action, talk only, right? But if you're all praxis, well, very soon your movement, without any theory, devolves into basically a very disorganized, semi-anarchic movement that basically ends up becoming more of an anarchist movement than a real movement of the masses, which leads us into point 2. You know, Peng taking over the Communist Party was really a matter of fortunate circumstance, basically, because Peng took over when he was only 23. Literally the youngest communist leader in the history of all humanity, right, was Peng. Right? How did Peng get that position? Well, he got it by killing his ex-boss Lai Tek. Now, to be fair, Lai Tek was basically a triple agent. The former head of the Communist Party, who was liquidated in Bangkok, basically thrown into a river, was basically a triple agent working for the British, the Japanese, and himself. So basically, yes, Lai Tek was he was the OG grifter, the original grifter, right? And when the communists found out about Lai Tek's treason, they found out that he was really a grifter, well, Lai Tek absconded with a lot of money in terms of, I think it was $1 million worth of party funds in today's money. He absconded to Thailand to escape, right? So Peng goes to Thailand, and basically the Thai communists get to Lai Tek first, and they liquidate him, right? Of course, Peng was quite upset about this because he wanted to interrogate Lai Tek first before liquidating him. But anyway, by default, Peng, Lai Tek's right-hand man, becomes the new leader of the Communist Party of Malaya, right? And the problem is that at this time, basically in 1947, it's still basically many of the old members of the Communist Party were over a decade older than Peng, right? And many of them were veterans in the war against Japan, right? So it was difficult maintaining centralized authority in the party especially in an age-conscious Asian society, because many of the older members would have looked at Peng as some young upstart who didn't know what he was doing. So oftentimes, basically the party ended up doing things behind Peng's back, right? And there were things they did which basically he wouldn't have approved of, such as the village trials, basically, in which they would hold village trials and execute people whom they deemed reactionaries. But they did it behind his back because, well, Peng was young and inexperienced, right? And you can see how inexperienced Peng was in the start. Remember, this is only a 23-year-old man, yeah? Many of you haven't even finished university by the time you're in your 20s, right? You can see just how inexperienced Peng is when basically he goes about dealing with strike breakers, that is to say, people who break strikes. If the workers go on strike in order to protest their bad conditions, the bosses hire these people and they end up as people who will sabotage the strike. How does Peng deal with strike breakers? Well, he has them killed, right? As Peng explains.
Why was it okay to kill people in strikes?
Because usually there are some strike breakers try to sabotage the strike. So, how to deal with that? Yeah. So that if necessary, we can beat them. Probably we dare not beat them, you see. Or kill them as a warning to other strike breakers. Actually, majority of workers were happy about that. They didn't say no. If workers say no, we dare not do that.
They may have been too frightened to say no.
I don't think so.
Now, I certainly don't condone his method of doing things, right? Dealing with strike breakers by killing them is certainly not a civilized way of doing things. But you could say Peng at that time was inexperienced, a man with good intentions but still inexperienced. So strike breakers were basically treated like reactionaries pretty much. Which leads to my third point, is that they use some rather, shall we say, hardcore methods in dealing with people they regarded as reactionaries. You see, a reactionary is basically a person who holds back social progress, right? Or acts in a counter-revolutionary way, right? Now, basically, even people who had collaborated with the Japanese, or I should say people who had worked with the Japanese out of fear for their own lives, right, were also targeted as race traitors or pengkhianat bangsa and reactionary by the communists, right? So, the communists very soon found themselves losing support, right? Because of their very, very, very violent ways of dealing with anyone who was regarded as a reactionary, right? Bear in mind that not only do these people not have much theory on their side, right? Many of them were also hardened and brutalized by the enemies they were facing, the brutal Japanese army and the brutal British. Many of these men had experienced horrible conditions in prison, right? And they were very, very angry. What happens when you let a lumpen proletariat out of prison and you give him a gun, right? Well, of course he's going to strike back at society. So many times when people killed whom they deemed reactionaries, oftentimes it was just basically striking back at figures of authority, right? Like the headmaster of a Chinese independent school, for example, David Chen, right? David Chen was by no accounts, a guilty person, in the sense that David Chen disagreed with the communists, right? David Chen basically was even alleged to be spying for the Kuomintang. But because David Chen disagreed with the communists, and, well, anyone they didn't like was a reactionary, right? Well, what some of them did was they went and shot him, right? They shot him in cold blood, and David Chen is one of the many victims of the very, very hot-blooded and angry members of the Communist Party of Malaya, right? And very soon, the more moderate people of the party ended up quitting. They ended up quitting the party because they were so sick of all the violence. They were so sick of all the cruelties, rather, that the party enacted on anyone whom they regarded as a reactionary. And while we can acknowledge that these people were brutalized by the British and the Japanese, and they were very much a product of their own material conditions, it is important to learn not to repeat the same thing, right? Just because a person disagrees with us, it certainly does not make them a fascist or a reactionary, right? Because these people didn't really read theory, they didn't understand the difference between a reactionary and a person with false consciousness, right? A reactionary is somebody like Jordan Peterson, who's not living in false consciousness. He understands socialism all too well, and he's trying to create a distorted picture to the masses on what it really is, right? So that the masses can continue to live in false consciousness. But a person like basically a blue-collar MAGA worker who's very frustrated with his economic conditions, and basically he says that immigrants are stealing our jobs. No, that's not necessarily a reactionary. That person is just a person who is very frustrated with his material conditions and is living in a state of false consciousness. So as socialists, it is our job to fix people's state of false consciousness, not kill them for it, right? But unfortunately, because the Communist Party of Malaya had a lot of very, very angry, hot-blooded young men, many of whom had just come out of prison, well, basically they chose using a barrel of a gun rather than using the power of persuasion, right? But then again, at the same time, the British themselves were pretty brutal to the communists as well. So you can't blame them completely. But under our current material conditions, we don't need to be so hostile. And we don't even need to be so hostile to reactionaries, right? We can prove them wrong by showing that they have bad ideas, but we don't have to kill them. I'm not advocating that we go out and kill Jordan Peterson, right? We just prove him wrong, right? So the anarchic method, you can see the same thing in America when you have anarchists looting and rioting and attacking Asian businesses in particular, because they view Asian businesses as the symbols of capitalism. This is basically what some members of the Malayan Communist Party did when the British tried to starve them out by creating the new villages, which were basically concentration camps in order to cut off their support base, right? Which were the working class Chinese. Well, what some of the Communist Party members did was they basically turned, if they didn't use sweet potatoes or bananas, they turned to basically looting, because basically to them, the businessman, the Chinese or Indian Tauke, was basically the symbol of capitalism. Even though these petite bourgeoisie were basically struggling to make ends meet in colonial times, well, basically the looting occurred. There was looting that occurred, and basically people, out of desperation, the communists ended up forcing these people to hand over their rice, their provisions, and stuff like that in order to keep the communists alive, basically. So, yeah, the communists at the same time were caught in, between a rock and a hard place as well, because the British were trying to starve them out, and at the same time, they were extremely brutal in ensuring that, they would get the people's support by hook or by crook. And the looting that occurred, well, it was basically it was an unnecessary, or I should say an uncalled for step, right? That they could have asked nicely, you know. I would have asked nicely. I mean, if you ask nicely and you've got a gun, they'll probably give it to you, right? But you know, the thing is, well, unfortunately, the communists by that point were beyond the point of asking nicely for support, because they felt they really had no friends. They were like a cornered animal, basically. So when someone is in a state of desperation, well, that's what happens, basically. That's when the looting starts. And the shooting starts as well. There was no clear chain of command, right? Now, Peng claims that he never heard about what was going on, and his enemies would use that to show that his leadership was incompetent. Even if he wasn't a cold-blooded murderer, his leadership style was apparently incompetent, which I don't think it was. But as I said, Peng was inexperienced when he first took over, right? And also, there wasn't a clear chain of command, right? In most successful communist or socialist revolution, there's a clear chain of command, right? And those people, basically, the leader in charge, whether it's Lenin or Stalin, basically holds the people under him, basically keeps a tight watch of the people under him, right? So, to me, Peng's management style, rather, was far too laid back. Too laid back, if you ask me. He wasn't enough of a micromanager. And the problem is when you're in charge of a socialist party, you really need to enforce discipline sometimes, right? In order to prevent any anarchic lumpen elements from springing up. So, yeah, one thing they could have done was to be tighter on the discipline of their troops. To their credit, they did try to enforce discipline, right? They made it a rule, for example, that, you know, the members could not steal, could not take the people's property, could not abuse women, and could not be cruel to captives, right? But whether or not all those members followed those rules is another matter, because the rules were not enforced strictly enough, and they really need to be enforced strictly, because a revolution is not a party, it's not a dinner party, it is very serious business, right? And there cannot be any elements in this revolution that basically sabotage the revolution, intentionally or unintentionally. That's why I'm very harsh towards those reactionary elements in America, like Jackson Hinkle, who are trying to sabotage the global socialist movement. Because people say, why do you bother about America? Why don't you just focus on Malaysia? Well, that's because all the movements around the world are connected, you see. And especially when it concerns America, because what happens in America affects the whole world. If America becomes socialist, that's wonderful, because the rest of the world will find it easier to follow suit. But the problem is, America is not likely to become socialist in the current state of things, when you have so many reactionary infiltrators like Jackson Hinkle, who today will call themselves Marxists, and tomorrow will be found on Prager University doing a Thomas Sowell sort of video explaining why they were misguided in following socialism. Another thing that the communists basically, in retrospect, you know, were mistaken on, in my opinion, was they did not want to use pragmatic means, in the sense that they really did not understand, rather, that Malaya in its post-colonial days was basically a very poor backwater and undeveloped place, right? So basically another issue that the communists had was that they didn't have a plan to develop Malaya, in the sense that they were mainly focused on ousting the British, right? But they didn't seem to have a clear direction in their minds. as to how they would govern Malaya after that, right? And what they would do in order to build infrastructure and basically utilize the forces of production, right? Basically, their goal seemed very much on basically defeating the British, and they were extremely zealous in that goal, and basically that's what made it so difficult for them to see the forest from the trees sometimes, right? And basically, yeah, this is not a video meant to put down Peng or to put down the class struggle on the whole, which to me was a struggle born out of good intentions, right? Like Martin Luther King said, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. But the goal my goal in this video is basically to self-crit, right? Self-crit, and basically point out things that we need to learn from, right? So we don't repeat history in the future and alienate the masses from socialism, because at the moment socialism has got a very bad reputation in Malaysia, right? Because socialism is basically seen as communism's gay cousin, right? So our goal is basically to basically learn from our friends. I shouldn't even say our friends, because that could get me arrested and put into cold storage, right? Basically learn from the mistakes of past revolutions so that we can better improve. And I'm sure Peng would also agree that, we need to improve on how they did things, right? Okay, last point, and most important point, is a lack of class consciousness in the masses, right? The most important point of all is that basically a revolution might work under certain conditions, but under other conditions it might end up a disaster if you do everything the same way, right? And to me this is no more clearly illustrated than the Malayan Emergency, when they simply tried to cut and paste tactics of previous revolutions onto Malaysian soil, basically Malayan soil, without considering the very specific material conditions of Malaya, right? Now, the thing is that in 1940s Malaya, right, it was a very different place from the Malaysia that we live in today, right? Back then, Malaysia had not even entered the capitalist mode of production, right? Britain was far ahead of Malaysia. Malaysia was basically the region where the raw materials would be extracted. They would be sent back to Britain. Things like rubber, tin, timber, copper, pewter. These valuable resources would then be sent back to Britain in order to fuel the capitalist machine, right? But basically, Malaya hadn't even developed a sense of proletarian consciousness in most segments of the society, right? Now, the Chinese and the Indian working class, who were, if I may, imported over to Malaya to work as tin miners or rubber tappers, certainly had a sense of proletarian consciousness. They certainly understood that they were oppressed workers under the boot heel of capitalism as a result of imperialism, right? So even though they hadn't read much theory, because back then you couldn't just Google anything online. Today, anybody in any part of the world can read Das Kapital, right? But back then, your theory had to come from physical hardcover books. So, most of the Communist Party of Malaya did not have much of a sound grounding in theory, except for people like Peng, the leader Peng, and some other members of the senior leadership. Most people were quite basically not educated on the theoretical aspects of revolution, right? They were good fighters for sure, but they weren't educated in the theoretical aspects of revolution. And furthermore, many of them were illiterate because they came from an oppressed working class. But even so, they understood that they were an oppressed proletariat. And that's why they agreed to communism as an ideology, right? But, however, the Malay of 1940, the feudal Malay peasant, was living in a very, very different state of consciousness from the Chinese or the Indian working class person. Hell, even the Peranakan businessman, I'm a Peranakan by the way, the Peranakan businessman was also living in a very, very different state of material consciousness from the Sinkays, right? The new arrival Chinese who came on boats, who were trying to escape the war-torn, ravaged, opium-ridden nation of China, right? The sick man of Asia. They had a strong sense of proletarian consciousness. But the feudal Malay peasant in the village did not have any concept of proletarian consciousness, because the feudal Malay peasant, although we're talking about 1940, the feudal Malay peasant was living in the 19th century, not physically but metaphorically. The feudal Malay peasant lived in the 19th century, even in the 20th century. And this is a result of basically the sultans and the British constantly indoctrinating them to keep them in a 19th century state of mind, to prevent any notions of class consciousness, right? Because class consciousness is a very dangerous thing to the ruling class. So in order to keep them out of, politics, they kept the Malays in the rural areas, the hinterland, if you will. And basically, if you try to approach a Malay peasant in 1940, for example, or the 1930s, and you explain to them things like democracy, you introduce concepts like democracy or rule of the masses, well, they would look at you as if you were some kind of an alien from outer space, right? They would wonder what on earth you're talking about. Because the early 20th century Malay peasant, unlike the Russian peasant in Tsarist Russia, was not suffering the same kind of brutality and degradation that the Russian peasant was suffering, right? If you have a guy like Lenin coming around and explaining to the Russian peasant, although they might not be proletariat, explaining to them that they are an oppressed revolutionary class, considering that these people have endured immense hardships, immense suffering, and 2 wars that they did not want to be a part of in just a decade, well, these people will be revolutionized because they have very little to lose and everything to gain, right? But the Malay peasant was unfortunately kept in a state of false consciousness, or basically kept comfortable enough in order that he did not feel a need to compromise on his own security. And I'm not putting down our Malay friends, by saying this. I am saying, however, that basically when a guy like Peng approaches the Malay peasant and tells them that you are oppressed, we need to conduct class struggle, well, the Malay peasant is probably wondering, in what way am I oppressed? I'm actually quite happy to be living under the Sultan's rule, right? Because even when Munshi Abdullah, the 19th century liberal writer, came back with Western knowledge and tried to basically teach the Malays about things such as democracy or rule of the people, Munshi Abdullah, who was a Malay Muslim, found it to be a very, very frustrating process, because most people were not on board with his ideas, because most people were so firmly entrenched in the feudal way of life, right? So if Munshi Abdullah found it hard to persuade the people to move forward from feudalism, imagine how difficult it was for Peng, a son of Chinese migrants who doesn't speak their language, at least not yet, or at least spoke it very little at the time, who doesn't basically doesn't practice the same religion, and basically, you know, is seen as an alien, right? Not necessarily in a hostile way, but seen as somebody of China, right? Not somebody off the land, right? If he tries to persuade the Malay peasant class to engage in an armed struggle against the feudal and colonial authorities, well, they'll probably look at him like he's some kind of an alien. They probably looked at him like he was some kind of an alien and wondered, what exactly am I struggling against? I'm actually quite happy to be living the feudal peasant life, right? I get a piece of land in the village, I have a roof over my head, I have bananas to eat, and basically my life is quite content, right? Because basically the Sultan has trained him to be content, right? But anyway, basically, the essential ingredient for any successful revolution is to have a sense of class consciousness. You need to have a mass of people who feel that they're being abused and exploited by the powers that be, right? You need the people on your side. But unfortunately, it was very, very, very hard to convince the Malay masses to be on the communist side, because first of all, the communists could not shake off that image of being the Chinese party, right? Even with members like Abdullah Sidi or Rashid Maidin, it was still very difficult to shake off the image of the Chinese party. But it was even more difficult to convince the Malay peasantry in general in order to get on board with their cause, because the Malay peasants did not really see a communist revolution as benefiting them, and the communists really could not really articulate to them, perhaps due to a language barrier, but also due to a lack of theory, could not really articulate to them what false consciousness was, that they were living in a state of false consciousness, and that their material conditions would vastly improve under socialism. They could not articulate that to them, right? So that's why the Malay peasantry wasn't really on board with the communists. And that's why the communists had to resort to despotic inroads in order to get the people on board, which didn't, as you can imagine, did not endear them to the people, right? But the point is, just because something works in another part of the world, it doesn't mean it's going to work in this part of the world, because every nation is a part of its own, has its own culture and has its own material reality. Some nations are ready for socialism, while some other nations are more complex and will not see socialism for another couple of decades, perhaps even a century. This is not something that you can force on the people, as some of the Communist Party erroneously believed. It's not something you can force on the people, because if you force it on the people, they will feel resentful. It is something that the people have to accept willingly, right? So, you know, probably one thing that they had to do, or rather one thing that the communists should have done, was basically not use the name communism. And also, the idea of orthodox Marxism basically has to be adapted. Orthodox Marxism would have to be adapted to our local conditions, because if you're going to follow orthodox Marxism, that means you've also got to abolish the role of the Sultan, right? This was anathema to the Malay worldview of the 19th century and the 20th century, because the Sultans were part and parcel of their culture. And even in constitutional monarchies like Great Britain or or places like Japan, they still keep the emperor around, right? Even though the emperor is just a figurehead, you cannot abolish the royalty in those countries, because to abolish the royalty in those countries would basically be going against the public consciousness of the people, right? It wouldn't be wise, even if a socialist revolution were to occur in Japan, to simply abolish the monarchy like that, because to the people, to you, to the Marxists, to the Socialists, the king may just be seen as an outdated figure of authority. But to the people, to the masses who are not necessarily communists, the people that you've got to win over, the king is actually, well, a symbol of their culture, right? Malaysia is not exactly a pure capitalistic country either. We're semi-feudal and semi-capitalistic. Although the kings still have to follow the law, you still have to be very careful not to insult royalty. And so, you know, the kings, royalty as of now still holds a lot of sway over the people of Malaysia. So if you're going to bring in socialism, you need to fit in the material conditions as well, right? You need to keep the royalty around, right? Sure, I mean, you can regulate their power, but symbols of culture cannot simply be destroyed like that, because culture is very, very, very important to people's hearts, right? When you destroy people's culture, they feel as if you've attacked their identity. And because the communists oftentimes showed a rather callous attitude towards the Malay culture, or was seen to show a rather callous attitude towards the Malay culture, well, this did not endear them to the masses of Malay people. So I would suggest that anyone who wants to basically spearhead a socialist revolution, that, you know, they need to ensure the people that their cultural rights will be protected, their cultural norms will be respected, and of course their religion will basically be safeguarded under the Constitution. Their right to religion and respect towards their religion. Now, you can't follow Marx 100% in that regard, because Marx wanted the abolition of religion, right? Marx considered religion the opium of the masses, the soul of soulless conditions, and the heart of a heartless world, right? And he wanted religion to be abolished for the true happiness of the people, right? But the reality is that you can't do that. You can't do that because religion is a very important part of people's culture. Marx was wrong in the sense that, you know, people only turn to religion to cope with their miserable material conditions, because religion still gives people a deep sense of spirituality, and it still gives people a sense of comfort, right? So another thing we've got to do is we have to be very careful with how we approach religion. We don't have to be religious ourselves, but, you know, I always make it a point to show that I respect people's religious sensitivities, right? Even in my old workplace, which was not a Muslim workplace, you could bring ham sandwiches to school, to work, if you wanted to. I would never do that, right? If my Muslim colleague was fasting, I would never eat in front of my Muslim colleague, right? So I think another thing we got to do is basically demonstrate cultural sensitivity and show common sense in how we deal with people from different cultures. And we just need to navigate the intricacies of these cultures very, very carefully, right? I mean, look at China. China went from the Cultural Revolution. Mao Zedong went around basically smashing up the Four Roads, right? Or basically the symbols of feudalism, the symbols of the old world, which were symbols of oppression to the communists, right? But now the Communist Party of China admits that the Cultural Revolution was a mistake, right? And now it's basically trying to clean up its own image by promoting Confucius, when we all know that Mao Zedong hated Confucius, right? So our job should basically be to form a link with the people, but at the same time we need to show the people that their opinions are respected. Although we may not agree with their opinions, we hold them, at least we take them well. We are willing to take criticism from the people, and also we are happy to respect the traditions and cultural norms of the place, right? And yeah, that's basically all I have to say. And I hope that these 5 points will basically serve as a way to guide us for future revolutions that do not involve violence. I've never condoned violence. So for future movements so that we can better organize ourselves, right? And all right then, have a wonderful day. Ta-ta!